Hello, I am Barbara Shack. I'm the coordinator of the Internet of Production Alliance. I am very happy to welcome you to this November community call. Well, I will be saying very little, which is always delightful, because we have three guest speakers who will be updating you on the Internet of Production Alliance and taking a deep dive into the question of portability of open know-how. Before we dig into that, I just have a little bit of intro. So that was the agenda for today. As I said, updates, a deep dive into portability, and opening the discussion for next steps and how you and the wider community can be involved. But before we dig into those topics, I invite you to join. It's been shared a few times in the chat. I hope it's been reshared recently. This is a link to our pad for note-taking for today. The notes from the call will be shared in their respective logical locations on the forum, but it would be really helpful if everybody jumped in and at least wrote their names in the pad and contributed to note-taking as much as they have the capacity and desire for it. And that was actually it for me. Do use the chat as much as you would like. Ask questions. We'll be keeping an eye on them. I will now hand over to Andrew for an overall update on the IoPA Alliance's recent changes, activities, events, and partnerships over the past month.
Thanks, Barbara. Hi, everyone. If we could go on to the next slide, the first thing I want to do is to welcome Jessica and Tiberius to the team. I think, Tiberius, you introduced yourself a little bit on one of the previous community calls back in September. And Jessica will be introducing herself a little bit more in the next community call, when we'll be focusing a little bit more on the Maker project, which is a project to link together maker spaces in Europe and Africa. But I'm delighted to welcome you to the team. Jessica is our Maker project manager, and Tiberius will be helping with scoping around distributed contracting. So yeah, we're really excited to have you join us. Thank you. The next slide, please. We have kicked off work on scoping a people and skills open standard. This is the idea that we want to be able to, with open know-how, support the documentation and designs that you need to make something. With open nowhere, you figure out where those designs can be made. The next question is by who? And the open standard is in the very early stage. It's a real challenge for us because there is every makerspace has some kind of skills management, membership management system. Every educational institution has some kind of certification around skills, but this is actually going to be a big part of the Make project as well, a Maker passport. So it's a really important step for us, and I'm delighted to say that Sarah has been having some initial interviews with different people inputting into that. So if you've got any good ideas, anything we should be aware of for that people and skills standard, any interesting systems to share, please get in touch with Sarah. Do you want to add anything to that, Sarah?
Yes, sure. So yes, I have conducted a few interviews already, and have been having conversations along the lines of just to kind of get the thought process started on for when you receive requests for manufacturing and production in your spaces, either as a leader or an individual. You know, how do you maintain that data? What are some of the common themes that cut across the needs that you have in your spaces, and what are the gaps? And so again, please feel free to reach out. You can ask any questions in the notes, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much, Sarah. The next thing is that we have also kicked off the scoping of a contracting system. Now, unlike some of the other standards where we have to jump straight into using it, we have a little bit more time to scope this one out. before we have to implement it in the Make project. So I'm delighted to say that Tiberius is helping with this, and the idea is to be able to get to a point where we're able to distribute contracts to makers and to provide different platforms, different service bureaus, perhaps, manufacturing bureaus, with a means by which to do that. One of the ideas that I'm certainly very keen on in the scope is that we have a one-to-many contracting system. So instead of one order for 200,000 items, you could distribute a contract for 1,000 items to 200 makers. So, I'm trying to keep that sort of distributed manufacturing within scope, but there's a lot that goes into contracting at the best of times anyway, all the different dimensions of it. So I'm very glad to welcome Tiberius to help us have interviews and to produce a scoping document here. Tiberius, is there anything else you'd like to say as you're kicking off this work?
I don't know. I'm just waiting for the meetings to get a better grip of it. Start planning.
Is there anyone in particular you'd be interested in talking to? I've got a few people that are doing similar things already, but actually there aren't many people doing one-to-many contracts in the world. Everyone's doing one-to-one contracts. Is there, you're interested in hearing from businesses and platforms, that sort of thing? We can encourage people to make suggestions on that front.
Yes, I think that's part of the work, to have a list of potential stakeholders and have meetings with them. I do have some organizations in mind, but
yeah,
the
more the merrier. Yeah. Great, thank you very much. So we are also starting our work, or we have started our work on looking at the governance of the Internet of Production Alliance. There's a link there in the forum, the community forum for the Internet of Production Alliance. But this is becoming a bigger issue again because we're trying to grow our membership. Not to put too fine a point in it, but I've been the chair for 3 years now. Surely we might need term limits, things like that. So there's a range of things we should be talking about. But we're also getting to the point where we are appointing and needing to appoint board directors of the different legal entities that we're registering in Denmark, UK, US, Kenya, places like that. So there's a lot to think about in the governance processes, and even trying to understand what defines a member is a big deal for us. So I would like to ask you all to engage, and Max has put the link to that section of the forum in the chat there. Quick fire updates. The Hackaday platform has agreed to adopt the Open Know-How and Open Nowhere standards in hackaday.io. I'm delighted with that. They maintain a map of the world's hacker spaces, and so they're able to integrate Open Nowhere into that. But they also have an enormous amount of open hardware electronics documentation. So that they'll be working with their membership, with their users of the platform to adopt that standard. IoPA has introduced some new tools to report the location of machines through its website, a very simple form for collecting data for Open Nowhere, which is great. And Fab City OS has, we had meetings with them earlier in the year, which I'm realizing I should have put on the next slide, but I haven't. And it's adopting Open Nowhere into its mapping. It says, the slide says Open Know-How, but it's actually adopting Open Nowhere into the platform. Sorry, I got that wrong. The Fab City OS, Adam, do you want to say a 20-second description of what that is, please?
Sure. Actually, I just corrected in the chat that we've adopted
Perfect,
OpenNow
thank you.
for the core platform, and OpenNowhere I think might be considered for locational details,
Yeah.
but not yet confirmed. So just a mild correction there. And your question was about FabCityOS itself.
Yeah.
FabCityOS evolved from a previous project, the Reflow project on circular economy. It's a project that works from that base and concentrates on, material flows of all assets and inventories of designers and manufacturers, as well as digital assets as well, to produce a graph and an encrypted graph, or rather a trustworthy graph of complete flows of items for compliance within the European digital product passport environments and so on. So it's a system that allows for provenance of materials and designs, as well as accreditation, or at least mentioning of all those people involved in the entire flow, and recompense where required.
And you can see why we're so excited about that. Thank you so much, Adam. The events that we've been attending recently.
I just need to call time, Andrew, to make sure
really?
that this goes fast. Yeah.
Okay. We've attended quite a number of events recently. There's a couple of things missing from this list. One is that one is the Open Toolchain Foundation gathering that took place in Hamburg, which is a consultation exercise to create a new foundation for a series of tools to support hardware development, with those tools all being open source. So you can see a list of events that have happened here. It's been a very busy time. The result of this is new forms of fundraising, some new members, and some new partnerships as well. If you have any questions on any of these, we'll be trying to put out some posts about each of these events over the next few weeks, so you hear a little bit about them. Keep an eye out for those. But if you do have any questions, get in touch with me. I just want to say a big thank you to Field Ready UK, the charity that Field Ready had registered in the UK, but then actually didn't use, which is in the process of renaming itself the Internet of Production Foundation UK, and to the IoPA Foundation, one of our members, because over the last few weeks they have done an awful lot of work to make it possible for us to continue to our operations. We've had some severe problems with our banking recently because of Field Ready USA holding our main grant, and Field Ready USA facing all sorts of problems to do with its operations in Syria, which in the US it's allowed to do because it has State Department permission, but as soon as you move those funds out of the US, you start having severe headaches. So I just want to thank Field Ready UK and the IoPA Foundation for coming to the rescue there. Next slide, please. The African Makerspace Gathering is in 2 weeks. We will be attending that. So it's an important opportunity for us to meet a whole bunch of makerspaces from across the continent. We're also attaching to that a meeting for the Make project. You'll be hearing a little bit more about this in our December call. So in our call next month, you'll be hearing about that gathering and about the Make project in more detail. There's some links there. If you could go to the next slide, please. And I want to plug some other events that are coming up. There's a bit of a smaller gathering, particularly with the Interfacer team in Brussels next week. We are thinking of having a gathering of this alliance, the Internet of Production Alliance, in Hamburg on the first couple of days of March next year. But then also the Interfacer project is hosting something at a Fab City Hamburg conference and expo in Hamburg on March the 3rd and 4th next year. I am really excited about that. Anything that's called the future of making gets my attention. So I'm looking forward to that. So some dates for the diary there. And I think I'll hand back to you, Barbara, now. Thanks.
Thank you very much. You heard it first in a community call this month that IoPA Gathering 2023 is almost confirmed. This is really exciting, and we will be sharing more information about that. But now we're going to look back on the work that has been done since the beginning of this year, and more particularly over the last month. Sarah and Max will be telling you about the research and development that's been done on the topic of portability, thanks to the funding of the Sloan Foundation and the European NGI DAPC Accelerator. I hand over to you, Sarah.
All right, thank you so much. Could you head on to the next slide? I'm going to go ahead and stop my video so you can focus on the content on the screen. So, all right. So next slide, please. Yeah, you got it. That's the right one. So for those of you who are new to these calls, and as a reminder to what the Internet of Production set out to accomplish initially by working on an open know-how standard, the vision was and still is to support a decentralized manufacturing model that is based on the shared knowledge, allowing communities to produce and receive the products that they need faster from locally resourced materials, and resulting in reduced environmental impact. And so this research and development that Max Wardeh and I will be sharing today, which is co-funded by the Next Generation Internet Data Portability and Services Incubator, or NGI DAPC. There's a little more information in the notes, the community notes document on that organization. This focuses specifically on how OKH can be used specifically in the context of portability. So next slide. And who is the portability for, and what problem are we trying to solve? And so the IoPA membership, it represents many aspects of manufacturing. And for the DAPC project, we focused on makers and product designers and engineers. And just to specify, when we talk about makers, we're not only talking about hobbyists doing DIY projects at home or in maker spaces, as well as these makers. We're also talking about farmers who need to know, have the know-how how to make spare parts for their farm equipment to keep their farms operational. We're talking about scientific researchers who need to know how to make equipment to carry out research that would otherwise be prohibitively expensive. And we're also talking about humanitarian aid workers who need to know how to make medical equipment in local facilities using local materials, because they can't wait for things to be brought in. And so these makers, designers, and engineers, and others who are involved in these collaborative and distributed manufacturing projects need to be able to share their hardware projects, design, documentation, all of the files with collaborators. And they are currently not able to do so in a simple way that maintains the integrity of that project's data and files. Makers are forced either to share all of their project files and data centrally with all the risks that entails, or they're forced to rely on unstandardized bundling of project parts that could be missing critical components, data, and or contain certain outdated files. Okay, so in our work, if you could move on to the next slide, please. In this particular funded project that looks specifically at the Open Know-How Standard, OKH, and portability, our intended outcomes were basically these categorized into two major goals. And that was really looking at performing user testing of decentralized publishing with makers and platform partners, and to deploy a proof of concept, MVP, for enhanced data validation and maker tool for converting data of selected platforms. So those were the two main goals that we set out to do. And this work was done, in collaboration with several different partners, which Max will be getting more into as he describes the tooling later on. Next slide, please. And so overall, this is the process that we used for this research and development for OKH and portability in the work that we did. And this is very much generalized as a proof of concept for possible application to our continuing research and development process, as it has been incredibly successful for our purposes. And so one of the things I want to draw your attention to is in every stage of this generalized process is the word community. Because as we move through these conversations and what we're interested in towards the end of the discussion today is how can we ensure that the community, our intended audience, is engaged in this research, in this development at every stage. And so we conducted some project-specific research in the form of a survey, in the form of UX testing, and I have details on all of that process and methodological approach if people are interested. But really what we want to focus on in this call is what we did and to gather your feedback on how to continue to move forward. But just to give a little slice of what that assessment process looked like and getting the community involved early on in the proof of concept. Next slide, please. Hello. So this is just a sample from the community survey that we sent out at the beginning of the development of the proof of concept to get the conversation started and really to hear from you all, you know, what were some of the needs, what were some of the gaps, rather than taking a stab at what we thought would be helpful. We really got that information directly from you all. And so this is a sample question from that survey, which was sent out a couple of months ago, and there's a link to it there if you want to navigate to it later to see the full thing. This was one sample question that was asking makers, as you can see, personal, professional, which types, file types, formats that they consider to be essential for their work. And we asked questions along the lines of data types, file format types, platforms, and use that as a basis of understanding and a start for the development work, which Max will be talking about next. Next slide.
Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, as Sarah said, part of the process was to sort of actually build some sort of a proof of concept, a prototype, or a minimum viable product to test out some of these things and see how well they actually worked in these kinds of scenarios and use cases. And what we were sort of zeroed on in after, especially in phase 2 of DAPC, was to look at portability of project files to the solid ecosystem, which I'll talk about a little bit in a couple of slides for those who are not familiar with it, and also to local devices. Now, as some of you may know, obviously the Open Know-how standard, the initial version was developed with sort of discoverability in mind, and what we were interested in exploring was sort of what changes would be needed, or how can we develop it further into sort of being used for portability. With that, we built very heavily on the work of Open Source Ecology Germany. So Lucas and his team and Robin specifically from OSE Germany were very instrumental in helping us move this forward. And what they'd been working on over the last sort of couple of years is basically creating a linked data, excuse me, ontology based on the original Open Know-how specification. And we built on that. And there are a couple of reasons why we needed this to be linked data, primarily to do with the solid ecosystem, but there are some other advantages that I'll mention as well. And one of them is, for example, being able to use what are known as shape expressions. And this is a World Wide Web Consortium community group specification that allows you to sort of create essentially a sort of an alternative description of any kind of linked data ontology, which gives you a lot of really good validation tools. One of the key things, as Sarah mentioned in an earlier slide, is sort of the maintaining integrity of the data as data and files are moved around between systems and amongst makers. So being able to perform that kind of validation using very well-developed and standardized tooling was one of the key things that we wanted to also try and build into the process. Next slide, please. So overall, we focused on a couple of things. As I said, oh, yep, that one, thanks. It was sort of looking at being able to port data from any platform, essentially, to makers' local devices. This was done using, we started developing this sort of proof of concept called the OKH Project Porter. And it's the ability to use an OKH manifest. And here we're talking about a linked data manifest. So it's a manifest written with this sort of linked data format. And the idea is that you just send this one text file essentially to somebody. And with this tooling, they can basically bundle together all of the data, no matter where it's stored on the internet, as long as it's publicly accessible. They can bundle it together and have it all on their computer, on their local device, you know, whether that's design files, documentation files, the metadata itself. As a proof of concept, we developed a sort of a very simple tool there where you can just sort of use the manifest file and say where you want all the output to be put. You know, this is something that we already have some ideas of, obviously being able to sort of view some of the project metadata within the tooling. These are some of the things that this tooling doesn't have, but the solid tooling does at the moment. And it also allows for being able to do this via the command line for those who prefer to use the command line as well. And I invite you to go to this link here. You can download the binaries for Windows and Mac OS and Linux, as well as experiment with the command line version if you're interested in that. Next slide, please. We also worked on developing this sort of OKH, what we're calling the OKH Solid app. And this is an app that basically enables the storing of project metadata and project files on the Solid ecosystem. One of the, in essence, the Solid ecosystem is one where it allows you to use something known as a Solid pod, which is a personalized sort of a data storage place on the web where you can control, you have full control as a user over who gets to access it, which apps get to access it. So, you know, in the case of the Solid, the OKH Solid app, as with any other Solid app, you'd need to have a pod or create one if you don't have one. And then once you have an account, and once you log in, if you move to the next slide, again, very similar in terms, in principle to the what we're calling the OKH Project Porter. You can use a manifest file. So if somebody sends you a URL to a manifest file, or if they send it, you know, as an attachment to an email or whatever, you can upload it using this Solid app, and then it will automatically extract all of the data and the files and actually put them on the Solid pod. So one of the key things to emphasize with this particular product is that once you port a project from anywhere on the internet, you know, this particular one you can see was ported from Wikifactory. It's actually, all of the data and the files are actually sitting in your Solid pod. So you have full control over these files and the metadata, and you can then share a link to the manifest file. So you have your own copy of the manifest file, which you can then share with somebody else, and they can then actually obtain another copy of the project directly from your Solid pod, thereby basically disintermediating the platforms if need be, depending on the context. And again, it's deployed there on that URL, Solid app, solid-app.internetofproduction.org. I'd invite you to take a look and try it out. And the source code is all there in that GitHub repository as well. Next slide, please. And a little bit more about the Solid ecosystem, just to give those of you who are not familiar with it some context. As you can see from that sort of very high level sort of diagram, the idea is that you have these, you know, conceptually, if you think of this sort of, on the right there, you've got pods, and each of these pods belong to a specific user, and they can be stored anywhere on the internet. And you build apps that actually sort of control the access, where the user has full control over access to those pods. And one of the key things with Solid is that once you actually have your data in your Solid pod, you can have multiple applications accessing the same data, and it's so you're centralizing the data instead of centralizing the application. by centralizing, I mean, you're keeping the data in one place and allowing access to multiple applications, as opposed to the typical model where every time you use a different application, you have to replicate the data somewhere else. It is moving towards becoming an official W3C specification. It's a W3C community standard at the moment, and it's led by Tim Berners-Lee. Just last week, he officially announced that he wants to start the process of actually getting it adopted as an official W3C specification, as opposed to a W3C community specification. And as I mentioned, it is sort of linked data at its core. And I mean, there are many advantages to linked data. I'm happy to have a conversation with any of you in more detail about this. But I mean, some of the examples where it can be very useful in the context of open know-how is with linked data, you can actually very clearly and accurately track provenance of projects, especially in the case of derivatives. You can see sort of who's moved things from where to where. You can very clearly sort of be able to know who the contributors are and maintainers. But you can also start to build sort of queries to know, okay, within this whole ecosystem, I want to know all of the projects that are derivatives of this one project, or I want to know all of the projects where this particular contributor has been active, for example, and many other ways in which linked data is a very powerful way of representing this. If you go to the next slide, please. So this is sort of a very sort of simple, high-level representation of kind of the approach that we've taken with portability in the context of the DAPSI project. There is another aspect to portability, which is portability between platforms, sort of directly going from one platform to another. But that and we did do some work on doing some of that mapping in phase 1, but in phase 2, part of the, as Sarah explained, sort of the KPIs or the targets we were sort of directed towards was more to do with this kind of distributed project portability. And as you can see, sort of at the heart of that is the idea is that you have, if you have an open know-how linked data manifest, then that becomes basically the key to being able to use the tooling that we developed, or any other tooling, hopefully if other people are interested in sort of moving this work forward, to be able to port the data, which I've sort of represented as the green dotted line. So the black line is kind of the user journey, if you like, whereas the green line is me trying to represent the fact that, you know, the data is just being taken directly from one place to another place using the combination of the metadata with the manifest, as well as the tooling that we've developed. And yeah, that's me wrapping up. So Sarah, over to you for starting what I hope will be a very interesting conversation.
Sure. Thank you, Max. And so this is where, you know, we were really keen to use a part of this call to have a conversation with you all about the research that we've done, the developments that have come out of that, and possible use cases for it, and how to move forward. And so next slide, please. And so what we would really like to do is if everybody could navigate to that link and pull us really into the shared pad that we have. We're using Framapad, so it's entirely open and accessible. And this can be a place to capture our conversation. If everybody could navigate to that, and then we could stop with the screen share temporarily so we can see each other for conversation. Hello. Thank you, Max. Thank you. So one of the places that we wanted to start, if you navigate to that link, you know, we have questions to consider around line 81. So actually, if you go to line 68 in the document, this is where we wanted to gather more thoughts and feedback from you all about what the next steps for this development could be, possible use cases for it. And that's really where I would like to start the discussion. On line 71, under possible use cases for the OKH project porter and Solid app, I have entered a couple of examples that have come to mind. I'm glad to unpack any of those. But I would first like to open it up to anybody here and get your thoughts about, understanding the utility that, the OKH specification standard manifest, can have lending to portability. Where could you see this tooling that's been developed be operational in the field?
Can you give us some of your thoughts what this might look like, just to seed the conversation, please, Sarah? So we,
Of course.
I mean, because I faced all sorts of problems with this issue when I was at Engineers Without Borders. Well, yes, at Engineers Without Borders, but also at Field Ready. And I just, I'm not quite sure where to start. So it'd be useful to hear a little bit about,
Of course,
the kind of thing you were imagining to get the juices flowing.
of course, of course. And this is very much coming from my background, where I've worked with a lot of communities in low and no bandwidth areas. And so we have orchestrated a system for peer-to-peer production that basically relies on a data courier model, where having, all of the associated data and files bundled together, and then available to give to a courier and then distribute using, let's say, a Rachel device, for broadcast in a classroom, would be incredibly helpful. And so on the ground, what I think that could look like, I'll give an example of, a class that I have worked with in Malawi in years past in my previous job. Oh, sorry, Max, you have your hand up. Go for it.
No, when you're done. Sorry.
Okay, because it relies on another peer-to-peer production model. I don't really want to conflate it too much, but so I'll just, in brief, we would receive requests from educators and from students about, we need to solve this problem, whether it's, we have an issue with, measuring water quality, or we have all of this, trash that we want to use to recycle for, particular builds or even toys, and asking questions about how do we go about that? What are the instructions? What are the design files? And there's really no elegant way to be able to share all of the information where we can let them maintain control of that content without partnering with other third parties. Like Calibri is one that comes to mind. So I'll pass that on to Max.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just wanted to sort of add one of the key things that I sort of started to work with and develop as we were working on this tooling is that, some of the feedback, I think, which is very valid, is sort of, how is this any different to sort of just being able to sort of put all your files on, GitLab or GitHub and just, download the zip file, for example, which I think is, a very valid use case. And that's a good way of using these platforms if that's the intended outcome. I think with hardware designs, with any project that goes beyond being a fairly simple project. So, if all you have is 3D designs, or all you have is sort of 3D designs and documentation, then using something like any particular, I don't want to name platforms, but using a platform that specializes in that could be very well. But a lot of projects end up using a lot of different types of files for different types of designs, bills of materials, and different sort of, there are lots of different standards. And of course, when you start to talk about software, and especially a product that might need different, like multiple software repositories, which might be stored on multiple platforms, the idea of being able to have this sort of tooling and this way of describing sort of a disparate, like where things are just in disparate places, and being able to bring them all into one place, literally at the click of a button, when you need to sort of collect all of that information, is, I think that's where this kind of tooling and this kind of approach for use cases like that might provide some really good traction. So I think, yeah, that's just some food for thought, hopefully, for some people. Yes, Adam.
Yeah, I was just going to add to some of things that you were going to say. Whilst I like the flexibility of linked data, there's a tension between that and being sort of data first class objects as well in terms of portability. So with linked data and linked to multiple sources, may well end up finding the collection of data within a resource fragmentedly available through websites going down or URLs moving, etc., etc. It's a challenge, I know, and I certainly don't have any answer on this. But this is one of the tensions within a linked data model, and or trying to look at perhaps slightly different methods that are flexible to allow a collection into one place of the complete set of documentation to give that robustness, especially within federated and peer-to-peer systems. Yeah, so just a comment there.
Yeah, no, thanks. And it is, I think, this is, it's a very, it is a, I think there are a lot of challenges with this, especially when it comes, I mean, some of the approaches are sort of to create very well-defined namespaces for different types of things. And, if it's used well, linked data you can easily sort of change locations of the things by, basically you can dereference things so that essentially the descriptor isn't linked to a physical, an actual real location. It's just sort of a dereferenced locator that can then be sort of moved around.
Sure.
But yeah, but there are a lot of implementations, sort of specific gotchas that people have to look out for in these scenarios.
Yeah, there's no wrong or right answer, I think, on that.
Yeah.
Other than I think version controlling as well is another issue that can assist or is related very carefully with that.
Yeah.
I really like the way that Andrew has framed this in the notes document about overarchingly, like just as an umbrella, that what has been developed can allow provides the allowance for humanitarian agencies to be able to port documentation for hardware designs, projects, and their own knowledge management without having to become an institutional partner. And this comes up in multiple conversations, and that was one of the reasons why, and I know that Robert joins this conversation, so feel free to chime in if you would like to. This is why I had made reference to the GOS part in the pronunciation of the acronym. But when we had started conversations about quality assurance and in open designs for medical devices, there was this conversation about, where should it be seated? We were talking about where should the institutional repository be? There's a lot of these conversations regarding ownership and, how where a lot of this documentation would live and have a seat. And so that is really what came to mind. And dovetailing that with Andrew's comment is that this really, I see it as this as providing organizations the agency to be able to carry and maintain their own work. What do you think, Robert?
Well, so, I'm pretty anti-cryptocurrency, but people sometimes talk about the blockchain as a distributed mechanism for that. I think in these cases, we don't need to do that. The model for this is kind of already available in GitHub, right? In the sense that you have multiple places that can be the custodian of the information, but if it's properly licensed, the notion of ownership kind of disappears. Right. So, you can have a copy of it here, you can have a copy of it there, and you don't need a central authority. Okay. So you don't need a real owner, but you do need to make sure that the information isn't lost and is discoverable. So I think you're on the right track, and I have to admit I'm a little hazy on what Solid does. So thank you.
Adam?
Just a comment. Thank you, Robin. I thought that's a good insight. And of course, there's the tension between offline and low bandwidth networking and blockchain infrastructure itself. One of the approaches that at least we're taking in the FabCity OS is to make such cryptographic portable objects associated with events and changes, so that offline networks can receive for better transfer of the assurity that you have. As you rightly say, a blockchain is a root of trust, not necessarily the only root of trust, and it can be used in some circumstances. But portable cryptographic data objects offer a more fine-grained and localized form of trust and verification within systems.
Yeah, let me go out on a limb here and say, you know, in crisis management, there are a lot of needs that go beyond making, including just the documentation of what needs to be made, right? Like what the needs are in those things. And if OKH could integrate with a system which was attempting to document an urgent need, you know, like for water or food or something like that, it could be very interesting.
Just one quick comment as well, Robert, in terms of Solid. I mean, yes, Solid is, yeah, it's still very much in sort of heavy development, even though it is relatively stable in a lot of ways. As I said, it's been going for quite a number of years now. And it's reached that level of maturity where hopefully it will be adopted as an official standard, I guess within the next year or two, depending on how long these processes take within the W3C. And if you do go to the about page of the Solid app, we have some links to sort of some videos and explainers that can help explain a little bit more about the Solid ecosystem itself. So, you know, I'd invite you to take a look at those, and feel free to reach out to me at any time if you wanted to take a deeper dive.
And we're just about at the hour. So one of the things that I have done here is put a link to the demo of the tooling. It's around 6 minutes long. I encourage you to navigate to that to take a look. And also, as you know, Max posits, reach out to him with any questions. I will do a screen share of the last slide. So you can see our contact information. There we go. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Those are our handles on Twitter, our general email contact, and also, you know, we invite you to join our community discussion. We're on Discourse, and that is where a lot of these ongoing conversations are threaded. And we'll be following up with every attendee from today's call with the notes, a copy of the slide deck, as well as you know, how inviting people to continue the conversation and to engage. So any final thoughts from either Andrew or Barbara before we wrap?
Yeah. I want to encourage you to join the forum, also to hear about when the next community call will be. It will be focused on the Make project that Andrew introduced briefly. And there will be quite a lot of different elements to discuss there around the different topics we're going to be exploring in that project. And that being said, we would very much welcome any presentation by any of you or other, let's say, people and organizations who are building an internet of production or are contributing to distributed manufacturing, to feature them in the call like we have in some of the previous ones. So if you feel like that could be you, or that you know an organization or a person that we should definitely be spotlighting or inviting to speak, let me know. And you'll hear about the next call on the forum or in the newsletter, which is probably how you heard about this one as well. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us. Andrew, any final words?
Thanks all. See you next month.
See ya.
Thank you very
And
much.
well
Thank
done, Max
you.
and the team for the demo today. Thank you very much.